helping us understand what medical device regulatory landscape in Africa looks like, the opportunities for professionals, but also the nuances around practicing within that ecosystem so that we're able to drive value and deliver that value to the patients who are counting on us to give them the solution. But on the other end, ensuring that the regulatory controls that are in place are robust enough to safeguard the patient and the public health interest. And therefore, then we're able to balance innovation, business, and care and access to solutions that people need. That is a critical bit. Then finally, all this to happen, we need a robust ecosystem, and that ecosystem should be able to support the business in the biopharmaceutical industry as it is, whether in the med tech solutions or in the pharmaceutical industry, whatever it is, there's need to be an innovative partnership component, which will be able to ensure that we have the resources, we have the people, we have the ecosystem that is able to sustain that. So that was the founding principle behind African Pharmaceutical Network. And the key gaps that were noted, limited local manufacturing still is there, segregated continental pharma industry, everybody playing in their own small domain, but we're not communicating to each other, we're not collaborating, we're not shaping futures. And there was not such kind of a platform. And therefore, that was the mission as to why let's put up African Pharmaceutical Network, where we would engage with professionals and stakeholders within the ecosystem to deliver value. The aim, I've already mentioned them, knowledge sharing, policy shaping, and business ecosystem support, and that forms our priorities as we move along. Workforce development, business ecosystem support, and shaping policies from a regulatory, but also from an ecosystem perspective where we're looking at the business aspect, the human resource, the workforce, and all that. How do we deliver on this? Industry discussion forums, this is one of them. We offer training programs, and some of the people who are in this call actually are beneficiaries of our training programs or are currently continuing their learning. We do a lot of policy work, research related, offer technical support, market intelligence to stakeholders and people we engage with, depending on the needs that are available and how our expertise can deliver that value. And there's a platform we could all work together. This is the team that we are working with behind the ideas of what we are working on. So we have a board of advisors, the three on the top of the screen, McDonald, Kirti, and John Paul Molo. Then the founding team who are part of the steering team driving the work is myself, Dongo Kelvin, the head of operations, Esther Nyango, Anushri Patel, and Juliet Uma, who is our programs assistant. And I believe most of you have already received emails or communication from her on that regard. Some of the partners we have FIP, IFPMA, H3D Foundation, Bloom Public Health, Empower Swiss, Africa Pharmaceutical Forum, Agriculture, and the Spark. In terms of geographical footprint, we have a presence in some of the countries where you see the blue colors in the African continent. And we're hoping that we could be able to grow and strengthen that blue color beyond where it is at the moment, in the sense that get more countries on board, but also build our footprint in those countries where we have a presence. The offerings at the moment, the courses, we have regulatory affairs training and pharmacovigilance and patient safety, which the first cohort will be starting in May this year. So that is an overview of where we are, what we do. What next for you as somebody who is in this forum, and if you're interested in being part of African Pharmaceutical Network. You can become a member, and my colleague Juliet will be sharing a link on how you can enroll and be a member of the network. You partner with us on some of the projects that we execute, some of your needs, we could see how we can collaborate on that and get some of our services as we move along, or even get to be a learner in our program. With that, I'll come to the end of the introductory bit, and you're open to ask any questions on that, share any feedback, any comments that you might have as we move along with the conversation. But also an opportunity for me to introduce now our keynote speaker for the session today. So we will Steve Kipkoti. Steve Kipkoti actually is a senior regulatory specialist, affairs specialist with Medtronics. He's focusing on the medtech and innovative solutions, and therefore, in terms of his experience and his work, he'll be able to share with us on the medical devices regulatory landscape in Africa and the opportunities that exist for regulatory affairs professionals. Beyond his core job with Medtronics, he also doubles up as the chairperson of the Medical Device Technologies Association of Kenya, so MEDAC in abbreviation. With that, I'll welcome you over to take over from me, Steve. I hope you can hear me as well.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Fantastic. Yes, I can hear you. Perfect. Thank you. Can see you as well.
Great. Good evening to everyone. Good evening, David. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation. Excited to be part of this event and looking forward to just engage and share knowledge with a wide diverse of individuals and professionals. Let me know if you're ready to proceed. Can I just share my screen?
Please feel free to.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect.
Okay.
You can see your screen.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Just minimize that. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the going to be a short lecture, but more so a fluid conversation with some nuances on what exactly is entailed when it comes to when we're talking about medical devices and regulations in Africa. Just to give you a quick background, I've been working in the healthcare space for over 10 years, just shortly over 10 years. And my background started into the industry. I started with pharmaceutical industry, working for GlaxoSmithKline. And after a few years working there, I got an opportunity to transition. I moved into the medical device space. And working between both industries with a regulatory context has been quite enriching, quite dynamic. For a lot of people maybe who have been exposed to that, they can attest. So I think let's just dive into it. And I'll be happy to share some questions or take some questions or insights from the floor thereafter. So when we're talking about drugs and medical devices, I think the picture on the screen just pretty much sums up what we know as drugs. Things that maybe come in a bottle or in a dosage form that is tangible and that you can probably carry around with you. So what we want to just contextualize when we look at content like this is devices, medical devices, which we're going to be talking about are by and large mechanical in nature and have an inert effect on the body, a human body. So pharmaceuticals, therefore, when you look at something on the screen like that, these are chemical in nature and are designed to interact actively with the body, and specifically the metabolic system or immune system. So therefore, there are different risks when you're looking at the body from pharmaceuticals. They're in a different magnitude and order to medical devices. So there are different risks when you're contextualizing medical devices and pharmaceuticals. So maybe just look into some of these. So when we're looking at healthcare, there's a distinction we need to make between the industries when we talk of medical devices and pharmaceuticals. MedTech has a vast category of products, very many iterations, and we'll just look at the 7 or so pillars that kind of you can look at to distinguish both industries. So when you're looking at both of these industries, there's often a confusion that is given, but let's look at the comparisons. The regulation is very critical to look at, rather these comparators, so that we can make a distinction between how to regulate them. Innovation is driven by physicians and engineers mostly, and also some IT components for medtech, whereas pharmacology, chemistry, biotechnology goes into pharma. I mean, when you look at amoxicillin's profile, the pharmacokinetics have been the same since it was developed. But for things like a medical device, you can tweak and calibrate, re-engineer some of those operations within the device. So iterations come up quite fast, which goes on to the life cycle. Very rapid and iterative in medtech. You can have as many as 500,000 products or medical devices to up to 2 million being issued or launched each year. So you have to look at the quantum of type of devices or variations rather of a therapy that you can get when you're talking of medtech. For pharmaceuticals, there's normally a patent year protection, a long year patent protection cycle. So for 13 years, there's almost like a right of exclusivity where they can be able to leverage and maximize their return on investment. Whereas once you deploy technology, also like in software or medical devices, you can take apart a device. Someone who's smart enough can reverse engineer components, and because of the access to certain components, they're able to kind of re-engineer or retweak and then redeploy into market with iterations that compete. So also the nature that we just talked about, mostly mechanical for medical devices, whereas pharmaceuticals are chemical and active on the immune or chemical system, the immune or nervous system, sorry. Product diversity as well. Diverse product sets when you're talking of medtech Pharmaceuticals are somehow limited to products or therapeutic classes. So medtech, I'll give you an example. If you're talking of medical devices, you can have diverse sets like a spine kit or trauma kit that's used in trauma surgery, and have many screws, nails, rods, different types of components. That one set can be seen as one kit, but when you're talking of each unit is seen as a medical device, if it comes in contact with the body, most of these are being implanted. And when you're talking about moving also consignment, that can be one kit with 200 different units within them, each with its own different screw head or screw nail size, screw thread. So such things need to be thought of. And also in terms of consignment, when you move one good to one, from one point to one location. Pharmaceuticals, mostly it's you buy one, you sell one when you're talking about retail or supply chain. But in medical devices, there's different types of compositions when it comes to even placement or points of care. As well, compliance is another distinguishing factor. There's more compliance for medical devices because of professional use and training. A lot of these devices are not operated, can be used as simple as or basic device can be used by a layman, but some which have to be very much under the use of a trained professional or in a very much controlled setting as well. Pharma prescriptions pretty much depend on the dosage regime and the adherence to that therapy that the patient complies to. As well, the outcome depends on surgeon skills for medical devices and the patient's response. So this training as well and continuous professional development is very much necessary when you're talking about medical technologies, as well with a very rapid industry, evolving industry. Pharmaceutical products depend mostly on the patient's response to the therapy. Again, when you're looking at adverse events, post-market surveillance issues, it's tied to the patient's systems, the patient system toxicity. It's comprised within the patient a lot of the times. But adverse events for medical devices are most often local in nature. Sometimes it could be due to the defect of a device. Sometimes it could a lot of the time be to the operator's use, if they have not used it according to its instructions for use or intended purpose. So some of these factors need to be really just well understood, or kind of, when you're looking at the content of both industries, always consider the context of these pillars. So let's also look at what else comprises the medtech industry. But again, I just wanted to mention, as a takeaway from this slide, the danger posed to the application, or rather the application of inappropriate regulations, which is what this lecture or session is about. The wrong regulations or practices employed to these industries, or rather cross-linked, can really lead to delayed product releases. And also in the market, we have delayed access to therapies for patients who really need them. And also in a globalized world, we know that people who travel really depend on their therapies, or as we're saying, really need the outcome to be dependent on the patient's access to these therapies. So again, we don't want to lead to unnecessary delays or increased treatment costs because of medical tourism or such needs. So regulations are there to enhance or bring better standards to the practice and increase access to the technologies or the therapies that are available in today's world. So distinguishing between these industries, I would say it's very much close, or rather easy to see a correlation between medtech more closely related to pharmaceuticals, or rather to IT. IT is similar in the sense that you're talking a lot of innovation, you're talking a lot of engineering and systems. There's systems which are driven by mechanical operation, electrical operations, or algorithms as well. So when we talk of systems, there's algorithms that drive certain softwares, just like in IT. So scientific basis is very much a core within these industries. Innovation, again, is very much a theme that's very integral. Research and development, when you're talking about the iterations that you need to drive product life cycles, calls for a lot of investment, a lot of R&D. So open source sharing, a lot of the time, sometimes people who are able to hack systems and also deploy or rather identify deficiencies in systems, you find also able to then drive better innovations or continuous developments. So there's a lot of valuable data that's derived from post-market or beta testing. You find sometimes when there's a new software and they know guys who are really keen on them, they'll try to pilot this software with the users to tweak in beta testing before they really go to market. You know, a lot of the time going to market is so fast for medtech when you compare it to pharma. So you want to be able to get the right first time or the best foot forward when you're deploying that. So a lot of these, you'll find the engagement with industry can be quite different also when you're dealing with medtech versus pharma, because they want to get feedback or rather insights from the users before they go full scale. Venture capital as well, when you're talking about investments, it's very much capital intensive. So hundreds of millions of dollars or hundreds of millions in any currency a lot of the time is called for when you're talking about what's your percentage of revenue or rather investment of investments versus revenue towards R&D, so that you can continuously keep building and innovating. Technology lifecycle as well is very fast again, so it won't belabor that. But again, there's a repository of accumulated operating knowledge. So institutional history and memory based on how to iterate things and how to redeploy, how to correlate and integrate things maybe that didn't work in the past, but now maybe have come to their time. So again, there's crucial distinctions between the industries. Limited resources also may affect the setup of these. When you're talking about regulations for these industries, you need to set up different departments. You see, like in pharmaceuticals, you may not need a software department. But when you're talking about regulation of medical devices, you may need some agencies or regulations that also have competencies when they're talking of software, when you're talking about IT, when you're talking about engineering concepts. Those need to be understood even from a regulatory standpoint. So different agencies, when you're talking about a lot of the agencies that have been set up to regulate, coming from a pharma background, especially in Africa. So these agencies, a lot of them were just set up perhaps primarily for pharmaceutical operation. But then now medical, again, we have come to regulations always catch up with practice. It's very rare that regulations go ahead of our practice. So especially for us in Africa, where we have seen pharmaceuticals having a bit more maturity in terms of regulation, again, because even the access or exposure by patients and HCPs is much more common there. Medical devices have been something that have just been evolving over time. So let's look at them also. The orientations that may need to be thought of or required when it comes to staffing, department agencies across different countries in Africa. How do you maximize or utilize your resources? And also, how do you then look at the nomenclature or definitions between the both industries? Yeah. Again, I just wanted to mention that I think, yeah, let's look at the next slide for me to pick up on that. Perfect. So what we're seeing here is something that can create a lot of rather misconceptions can be drawn from based on what is an intended use or what's understood to be the driving factor of a device. So interpretations can vary, but let's look at what an intended use is intended. Like it's defined as a significant factor in determining whether a product is regulated as a medical device. So what are you using this device for? Most of us all know what this is on the screen. It's a wearable. Most of us have them. If not on a wearable on the wrist, your phone probably has it. So normally if you get like those notifications like I do, where you've probably been told you're halfway through your day, you've almost closed your activity ring, maybe just give it another push for a workout so you can close it. So that's probably just giving you edification to know that you're probably about to close your 10,000 steps goal. but it's not necessarily driving an intended, or rather diagnosis or clinical decision for you to then make something useful out of it. Yeah. So governance of medical devices can really be tricky when you take the wrong application of what a device is intended for. And actually, that's why a lot of the time the manufacturer who's implementing or supplying a medical device is the one that determines or gives an intended use and clarifies that to the regulator, or rather to the user. And they're able to give a declaration or substantiation why it's being intended for that use. So there's clear do's and don'ts. So again, when we have a broad, and also when we're going to look at the clear definition according to the WHO as what a medical device is, which warrants its regulation or its controls rather around any risks. So again, anything that's intended for fitness and general wellness can be seen as an unregulated device. So this can be able to tell you probably your heart rate, but what does it? It doesn't do anything more with that information. Even with the medical devices, or rather the new Apple devices that they're saying now will be able to measure ECG, you'll find even when you try to, if you have those devices and you try to activate it, you'll find probably it says not active or not allowed in your country. I mean, in the US, there's also been challenges or issues of some of these implements that companies like Apple or other companies are implementing. The regulators are seeing it as, okay, are you then now giving that autonomy to a patient to then now say if this device can maybe operate an ECG and it tells me I'm at a high risk or I'm at an alert for a heart attack, is that a medical device? So there's still some big discussions out there about what is the intended use when some of these manufacturers are putting them in for commercial use or wearables like that, and what's the regulator standpoint. So just some food for thought for you, for everyone out there. But I think it's an interesting discussion, and it's one that I think we should continue having, just to continuously also build the best understanding, or rather even international understanding from an informed position, especially when we're developing regulations for us here in Africa. So when we're looking at medical devices, these can be so complex. What you see on the left is a simple tongue depressor, something that can measure, or rather a thermometer. But even a tongue depressor or a Band-Aid, cotton wool or cotton gauze, something just basic that you can find in a first aid kit or in your over-the-counter supermarkets, is considered a medical device. But even on the far right, what you see there, something as complex as a robotic surgery device with just, it's a whole system with components and different functions, softwares, and different drivers. When you consider this ecosystem of how complex a medical device is, then you definitely understand then there needs to be regulations in place to manage the risks. So concerns about the regulation and oversight of medical devices, these are just continuing globally to be raised, owing to the significant number of medical devices found to be of poor quality and unsafe and abandoned across health settings in African countries. So when you're talking about even in Africa, we have a lot of devices that could be donated to Africa or that are coming in as refurbished equipment. There needs to be some sort of framework to ensure the quality, or rather testing for the use or efficacy or safety of some of these devices is in place, or the manufacturer who's supplying these regulations in place that can define some regulations from best practice on how best to ascertain good products are actually being implemented into the territories, especially for Africa. If you don't have capacity from the regulators to do the pre-market testing, just because of there's no legal frameworks as such, perhaps, or there's no competence or expertise from a trained perspective, or even from a resource perspective of facilities to do the necessary testing, then you need to have regulations where you can look at reliance, or looking at getting the manufacturer or supplier to give attestations or testing certificates. Once a product has been refurbished, it's been recalibrated, tested to ensure that it's fit for purpose and safe for use. So the the background when it comes to regulation in medical devices is probably like almost 10 years now. When you're looking at 2015 going forward in SSA, some of the first countries to issue guidelines was in Africa, Tanzania. So there's been a lot of progress since then, but there's still a lot of rapid development where some of the devices coming out need to be managed with adeptness from a regulatory standpoint, but also at the same time, they need to be applied good principles to ensure that you're not over-regulating. You know, sometimes the adage that says you don't try to kill a fly with a bazooka. So something like, depending on if it's a bandage or a tongue depressor, what type of controls do you need to regulate that compared to the controls you need to regulate a robotic-assisted surgery device? So when you're looking at Africa, again, there's donated device, the devices which are procured, again, from high-income settings. Sometimes if they're not calibrated or designed to work in low-income settings, they might not be appropriate for use or might not serve their purpose or life cycle. You know, sometimes the challenges we have in Africa are not unique across the board, whereas we call load shedding in South Africa or power rationing here. It's the same impact. And also we have challenges when it comes to infrastructure, sometimes when it comes to access to data or access to networks across the board, especially in remote settings. So medical devices which have been developed or designed in high-income settings to work with such infrastructure as an ecosystem, you'll find may not serve the populations as they were intended to here. So challenges of mismatches between donations, recipient needs are things we need to consider when you're looking at medical devices. Because again, in Africa, majority of the consumption or medical device market is based on imports. And majority, or rather minority of the manufacturing is the basic consumables. So you may have complicated needs from a healthcare perspective on what you need to address, but then the capacity is wanting, and which is fair, because there just needs to be a lot of investment and still a lot of exposure, or rather a lot of access to engineering skills, innovation, expertise, materials, capacity and scale to then be able to serve the market. And also when you look at resources, cost of manufacturing, cost of employment, or cost of certain factors. So the needs that are met may be insufficient or may have a deficit from. So that's where you may have some of these donations or needs as well. Also, you have challenges with universal healthcare sometimes where it's not implemented, and you have patient populations who cannot access or do not have the finances to access some of these therapies, which are quite expensive or can be quite expensive. Again, when you're looking at devices which are not designed or developed for use in a tropical environment, you can have also challenges there. So there's a need and also initiative from an African Union perspective, the governmental perspective, to ensure that Africa can be able to build capacity to ensure that it can serve the populations. It has a growing population, Africa having the youngest in the world, and also with the growing economies, there's people who are living longer. So you have a young population, you have people who are going to be living longer. There's going to be a lot of need for geriatric care, and there's going to be a need for a lot of healthcare rather. And that burden exists already, you can feel it. So what do we need to do? There needs to be people who are forward thinking, people who are very nimble, people who are really keen to understand the challenges of today to develop and ensure that solutions for tomorrow are ready. So limited availability, again, of enabling infrastructure is things we've talked about: space, power supply, water supply sometimes, inadequately trained professionals, or personnel to properly maintain, use their devices? What if a device breaks down and you quickly need, or rather there's a therapy today and you need spare parts urgently? You need a nimble importation system or supply chain that can bring in product quickly in case you can't manufacture or access it locally. So these are all tied to regulatory frameworks. You need accessories for long-term maintenance. So some of these are challenges when it comes to regulatory frameworks and medical devices, yeah? Pharmaceuticals rarely require these, like you'll rarely be calling or rather pursuing from an accessory when it comes to a medical device or spare part, pharmaceutical. So also concerns arise about harm or significant harm or risk to patients arising from the introduction of poor quality, obsolete, or malfunctioning devices into health facilities and improper use by healthcare providers. So again, if a device has been made obsolete, how would we know? Yeah, and then if it's being dumped here, if it's not been tested, how would we know? So some of these issues or risks exist. So we just need to take this all into consideration. Medical devices, again, can be so complex. And I think when you're considering that technology, materials can be similar to those in science. When you're coming to electronics, software, IT, there can be nuclear or radioactive materials. So some of this can be used in a clinical practice or in home care practice. So there's a lot that goes into the considerations for regulating medical devices. So medical devices definition, we really need to get the nomenclature right. I like saying things don't go wrong, they start wrong. So IMDRF is the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum. This is a group of 6 or 7 countries, I think 7 right now, who came together and who are all developing regulations for medical devices. But at one point, there was no harmonization. So they all came together and developed a forum where they could all bring alignment to the regulations that were being developed so that they could ensure access could be guaranteed within each of their markets as well, and also for best practice to be established. So the US is one of the founding members. Japan is one of the founding members. Canada, Europe, the European Union. We also have Australia. We also have Switzerland. And I believe Ireland is also one of the members. So we have these members who have a forum, and they're the founding members, and they also bring on affiliate members, other countries who are regulators, like Singapore, the Singaporean HSA. We also have the Thai FDA. We also have the Saudi FDA. We also have Kenya's PPB. Regulatory bodies in other jurisdictions then become affiliate members with IMDRF, and then also IMDRF has been establishing guidelines or guiding principles documents to establish best practices on how to develop regulatory frameworks on medical devices. So medical devices, as a definition, is any instrument, apparatus, implement, machine, appliance, implant, reagent for in vitro use, software, material, or other similar related article, intended by the manufacturer, which is very key, to be used either alone or in combination for human beings for one of the more specific medical purposes. Again, so it can be for diagnosis, prevention, treatment, monitoring, alleviation of any disease. Again, so this information is there. I won't belabor it. You can just get a gist of. It's a very diverse, or rather, it's a very not diverse, but it can be very broad when you're considering a medical device. It can be used for various applications. So context is really clear in terms of what is this device intended for. I think you really need to start from there to understand if this is going to be a medical device. What's the function in terms of how is it going to interact with the patient? How is it meant to be operated? Who is meant to operate it? Where is it meant to be operated? How? So all those contextual questions go into aiding regulations of medical devices again. So again, it does not achieve, medical devices do not achieve its primary intended action by pharmacological, immunological, metabolic means in the human or the human body, but may be assisted in its intended function by such means. So again, it's to distinguish that it's nothing like a pharmaceutical in terms of its operation, but can be assisted by some of those functions or by some of those means. So then let's just look at some examples. I'm probably just going to allow everyone to just peek at the screen, get a familiarity of what's there. And there's an interesting picture right here. If people can be able to, I'm going to pose this or leave this as an interesting question. If people can guess what this is on the screen and maybe leave it on the chat, maybe we can revisit that later. Maybe give some points or recognition to anyone who can guess what these are. But again, what you see here are various medical devices. We have an implant device, pacemaker for the heart. We also have a Band-Aid, as we discussed earlier. We have an MRI machine over here on the bottom right. We have surgical injections, needles. We have heart rate devices. We have a stent. This is just this image here on your left, contact lenses. So these are so various in their devices, in their function and application. So it's just an appreciation for us to know what the scale or quantum of types of medical devices they are. Just maybe let's skip over to software as a medical device. I'm just going to touch on this high level. There can be software as a medical device again. The IMDRF has defined some of these. So software as a medical device specifically, there's different categories. Software which is intended to be used for one or more medical purposes that perform these, and it performs these purposes without being part of a hardware or a medical device. So that is seen as a software sometimes. Software in a medical device, there's a distinction between software as a medical device. This is software in a medical device that cannot operate separately from its device or perform its primary function without the device. Yeah, so these are just some considerations when it comes to regulating medical devices. You don't just consider the hardware, there's a software aspect. So some of these examples are typical, they can be common, but again, some of the classifications are designed by the manufacturer on an intended basis. How is the operation of the software and the hardware intended to run? So some of these could be on Windows computers, some of them could be on the cloud, some of them could also be on the iOS systems. So it's quite a consideration we kind of need to have. For example, software in a medical device. I'll give you an example. Software used to program and run an MRI machine would be useless without the MRI machine. So you'll find that software is in a medical device. It cannot operate without the MRI machine, and it cannot do its intended function without the MRI machine. So software in this category is regulated together with the entire MRI machine. So that's software, an example of software in a medical device. In some cases, you'll find a manufacturer may be able to bundle or embed software in a medical device. So that makes it software in a medical device as well. Or sometimes they can also sell it as an accessory. That makes it then software as a medical device. So there's also very much contextual nuance that you kind of need to have that. There's an agility or flexibility rather, depending on how these things are engineered. So again, I'm just going to mention some 4 points that are related to the categorization of a medical device software. It's all about the medical problem or its objective, the context of use, again, the function and use and change management. Again, you'll have softwares that have bugs or bug fixes sometimes, or software upgrades that need to be issued. So version 1 can be deployed, version 2 comes out. So how do you manage the lifecycle for software updates? So again, just let's look at some examples, because software by definition is capable of running, software as a medical device is capable of running independently of any medical device hardware. There's also a relatively clear line between software as a medical device and other medical software. So again, MRI machine again that we mentioned. So the software that controls the MRI machine is what we were talking about earlier. That's what we call SIMID. Yeah, SIMID. But software that evaluates the MRI machines, makes diagnosis recommendations. You see now it's driving clinical outcomes. Yeah, it's not the one just controlling the function of the machine, but it's the one that's giving clinical recommendations as such, or diagnosis. That is seen as software as a medical device. A mobile app that monitors a patient's heart rate or glucose levels and makes treatment recommendations to the patient or the patient's doctor, that is as a medical device software. But when you look at software that allows the patient to control the pump based on glucose readings, that's controlling the device as such, but not giving them a clinical diagnosis. Software is just allowing the calibration of the hardware. So there's a distinctions or somehow interpretation that needs to take hold there. And I hope those are at least beneficial when we come to understanding what software as a medical device entails or what it can be. So IMDRF again has brought classification recommendations for medical devices. So these are principles that are there to guide the classifications of medical devices. Again, because they're so vast and varied, a regulator could really lose their hair trying to figure out how to categorize or place a device. So these rules help establish best practice and an ease towards regulation formulation. So again, establishing a global rule-based classification system. So these 7 countries all decided we need to have one global rule-based system to correlate, the medical devices we're all talking about. If one device is meant to be used with another, the classification rules apply separately to each device. Yeah. If a device falls under multiple rules based on its intended use, there's the highest classification. So you could have 3 products in a sum of products which make a set, could have varied classes. The highest one takes hold. Again, so all these principles come down to then give us the main piece here, which is a global adoption of rules based for classification, which benefits manufacturers, the users, patients, regulatory authorities, and then also promotes regulatory convergence. It's all bringing the practice of all these entities together towards the one harmonized space. So again, IMDRF proposed classification systems for medical devices, and then WHO also recommends the IMDRF classification. So there's an interesting context here. IMDRF came together and to set these up, regulations again for medical devices. So it's good to note, IMDRF is a pioneer in this space. And in a lot of context, when it comes to medical devices, WHO does pull from IMDRF. It's actually not IMDRF that pulls from WHO. So where sometimes WHO might not even have guidelines for regulation of medical devices, IMDRF will. Or if they don't have guidelines, let's say on change notifications or variations, or maybe what is known more so in a pharma context, IMDRF would have. So they are the leaders in this space when it comes to health tech. So the risk levels are categorized in a 4-tier system, A, B, C, D, A being the lowest, D is the highest. And again, where the risk is low, the regulatory requirements also match the risk. So low risk means low requirements. The higher you go in the risk, the higher the requirements are in terms of regulations. And then you have examples of some of these devices. Again, you can see the nature of the devices. These are less invasive and more easy to operate, or rather do not need so much skilling or training, whereas some of these, which are more longer use, may be staying longer with the patient in terms of being implanted. They are getting in touch or maybe in contact with the nervous system or circulatory system. These have high risks to the patient, therefore also need to be controlled. So this nomenclature or tier system was then established. So we've looked at medical devices. IVDs also fall under this category, in vitro medical devices. These are reagents, calibrators, control materials, specimen receptacles, software, related instruments or apparatus. It's also quite, can be quite broad. These are all used for various test purposes, diagnosis or aiding in diagnosis, screening, monitoring, predisposition, prognosis, prediction, determination, physiological status. So a lot of these, when to talk of pathology, a lot of these equipments are related to pathology and that type of space. Food testing, when you talked of COVID test kits, pregnancy tests, these are all taking biological samples, either from a human or from a specimen or a tissue somewhere, and it's being used for diagnosis, screening, testing, various purposes. So IVDs also fall under medical devices. Again, the IMDRF definition exists, and this was defined back in 2012. So some of the examples there for your screen, you can see collection tubes for samples. We have HIV test kits, we have IVD kits, pregnancy kits, also instruments for sample preparation. So these also can be you can see they're very much like consumables. Some of them can be coming in very different sizes and variants, singularly and collectively. So there's a lot of different considerations that need to be had. Again, accessories exist for medical devices, and articles intended explicitly by the manufacturer to be used together with an IVD. Again, so the function is to enable the IVD to achieve its purpose, or it augments or extends the capability of the IVD. So, for example, if you need a swab to perform a certain test, some of those can be seen as an accessory. If you need some certain trays, for example, let's say if you're putting sample test kits or tubes, there could be trays or accessories, the bins that you're using for disposing biological samples. They could be quite various. Yeah? So some of these also could be software, for example, software that's meant to drive an analyzer, for example, as an IVD for testing. Tips and cups, again, as we mentioned, for doing sample collections or preparations, and then cleaning solutions. These also vary and all fall under IVDs or medical device regulation. So risk-based classifications for IVDs exist again. These are regulatory controls to safeguard and the health safety in patients, for patients, users, and other persons. Again, the criteria is slightly more focused compared to medical devices. The risks are looking at what's the intended purpose, again, or indication that the manufacturer has designated. What user and expertise is required? What's the user competence and expertise or training required? So you see some of these IVDs, it might not be operational for any layman to use, right? You might need specific training. Again, the importance of the information that the diagnosis carries. Again, when it's combined with other test results, signs and symptoms or history of the disease. Again, when talking of IVDs, some of the tests or diagnosis may have a public health outcome or issue. So again, there's a bigger impact when it comes to IVDs and public health. And the impact again of the result, if there's a false result or a positive result, it can have huge implications, right? So if you have food testing for a large manufacturer and there's a false positive, for example, that could be a huge recall, or it could be a huge reputational damage as well, or it could be a huge risk. What if blood bags are being tested and for HIV and there's a false, the test is not accurate, and then the blood is supplied? There's a public health issue. So there's a lot of risk there. Because of that risk, there's a classification system also associated for IVDs, which is pretty much correlational. Public health risk, if it increases, you need to have higher controls for IVDs. So if there's a low individual or public health risk, you see like bacteria culture, or rather culture for media for just doing some tests, clinical chemistry analyzers, that's low risk. But things like diagnosis again of HIV, or screening of blood for various diseases or pathogens can really carry a huge risk. So the requirements vary. Again, when you look at any pandemic or any disease which warrants such testing, you can imagine like COVID, where we went through such. The need for some of these equipments really drove governments crazy. And then also when you're looking at the capacity and the need for regulatory framework to allow access, if there's no manufacturing capacity, then and you can't move your people, then you need to move these devices. So when we're looking at how to bring a product to market, there's various principles, or there's a pathway that one follows as a manufacturer. And when we're looking at regulations of medical devices, the contexts also differ when you're coming from a pharmaceutical understanding or background. Again, you can look at a misconception that kind of centers on the difference in availability of clinical evidence for pharmaceuticals and medical devices. Yeah, sometimes there are claims and that no clinical data may exist for medical devices. So clinical data and that the evaluation data, and the evaluation of that clinical data sometimes is clearly and explicitly defined as a legal requirement for medical devices. So for both medical devices which are implantable or high risk, the clinical evaluation must be based on data obtained from clinical investigations. So again, unless there's a justification to rely on existing clinical data, there has to be some evidence provided. So when it comes to also requiring the same type of clinical data for devices such as pharmaceuticals or drugs, it's worth highlighting. It's unlike in pharmaceuticals, randomized clinical trials are not the gold standard on how to assess effectiveness and safety in medical devices. Yeah, most devices, and let's look at why. Most devices cannot be evaluated with randomized clinical trials, as it's hard to blind and randomize a device due to the strong ethical or practical issues in the choice of a comparator. Yeah, I mean, how would you be able to decide this would be the best comparator for the implantable defibrillator you're testing? Where, how do you look at the bias or manage the bias wherever there's an inclination? Yeah. Sometimes also, how would one place a hip implant and do a placebo test for that, right? How would you implant a placebo hip if you want to do a randomized trial? So some of these concepts when it comes to the data required needs to be looked at differently. So again, the device's impact depends heavily on clinician training and experience, patient selection, and the care delivery setting. Again, it can depending on how the doctor is trained, where the doctor is trained, the country that the doctor is operating in. It's somehow nearly impossible to predict with any precision. So real-world data from observational studies performed under routine conditions are equally important. So post-market surveillance is very much important when it comes to getting better regulations or data to support clinical investigations for medical devices. So we're going to just look at, again, some of the African contexts. Pre-market regulations vary from country to country in Africa. You'll have some of the countries that they have been reported to have, and especially when it comes to just the starting of regulating medical devices, it was very basic regulations or requirements in Africa. It was just requiring an intended instructions for use, what we call an IFU. Just basically is like the manual for the medical device, a declaration of conformity, which is it's applied by the manufacturer. This is the declaration that defines the risk category and the classification of the medical device. Again, an ISO certificate to ensure or to justify, substantiate the medical device is coming from a reputable or certified manufacturer. So a lot of the time, these are few requirements that are just needed to get a product to market when it comes to medical devices, what we would call a listing requirements. So a few countries reported that to have any literature or requirements for medical device regulations as pre-market assessments. So countries across East Africa, like Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, even West Africa, we had Ghana, Togo. We have some countries like Morocco, all across the continent. It's not unique. Some of these requirements are very basic, but then over time, then IMDRF principles have been borrowed, have been looked at, and then the transition is moving away from listings to then full regulations, or rather common dossier requirements. So there's a common dossier structure that's being looked at, and that's being considered now for the implementation of medical devices. So some of these countries, again, at the same time, need capacity to implement or evaluate the medical devices. And also, when you're looking at the challenge of autonomy and sovereignty, you have all these countries that want to do pre-market regulations or assessments, but then because they are developing their regulations country to country, manufacturers are seeking to register across in these several countries. There's a challenge because each country is going to have unique regulatory requirements. So for market introduction, each manufacturer has to have these requirements met for country A, country B, country C. It becomes quite complex. So there's a very much need to harmonize and bring reliance or congruence towards regulations, especially where we have one regional, we're in regional blocks where we're in one economic block where we trade amongst each other, but what you have regulations that are not enabling the trade. So it somehow becomes a catch-22. So there's a lot of also capacity that's needed for just once the moment a product is goes through this pre-market assessment, establishing the product by the manufacturer, they define the intended use and all these factors. They verify that it's a medical device, the classification and regulatory pathway to then get the product authorized, let's say EU or US, then some scientific evidence, testing, pre-market submissions. All of these need to also they need resource, and then that's just to get the product life cycle approved. Now imagine the post-market activities or resources needed. So there needs to be a consideration on where you're going to put your resources, especially where you have so little but so much to do. There needs to be a very much informed, or rather well thought out application. How do you best utilize your resources? If not just a manufacturer as well, because manufacturers are doing that. They've done their homework to, by the time they're going to market, they have a business case. Regulators at the same time need to have a business case on the needs of the market, the needs rather of their patients, the governments that they're been tasked to serve. How are they going to best utilize their resources from a regulatory standpoint? So safety doesn't happen by accident. It has to be a very deliberate and intentional move. So, and no one has a monopoly on science. The government doesn't have it, neither does the private industry. So this is where we come together. A lot of the people on the call, I believe, are from industry or private practice in some capacity. It's very much behooves us to then collaborate with the regulators so that we can also be, they're the policymakers, but also we need to be the thought leaders who are speaking with them to help them understand the industries that we're working with, the technologies that we're providing, also no one really cares what you have to say until they know how much you care. So it's very important for them to know that we care about the patients. They're not the only ones who care about serving the patients, because that's why we're here at the end of the day. So the regulations of medical devices been adopted by various NRAs. These are national regulatory authorities. So again, these have been set from a pharma context, primarily manufacture, import, export, as well as the sale and distribution. Again, this has a lot of experience. Most of the regulators have been doing this. But then now staffing them, all of these regulatory bodies or NRAs have been staffed for that purpose, managing the import, export, distribution, wholesale of pharmaceuticals. Now, how do we sensitize regulators? Like if a medical device company is coming to the country, wants to set up, see COVID, for example, when COVID came in, we found out there was no vaccine manufacturing, and vaccines and pharma have some level of mature regulations in the continent. Despite that, the maturity frameworks, or rather the regulatory frameworks, were not seen as mature enough by some players for them to invest or come in to actually set up manufacturers. So there needs to be that collaboration of open sharing and access, rather, to also educate each other. The regulator educates us, and we also educate the regulator. And most importantly is the attitudes that we go into these relationships with. We really need to be humble, but at the same time candid about where we're coming from and where we want to go, so that we're both allies on different sides of the track, but we both need to work together. So some of the functions of the regulators need to be relooked at. Human resource, the orientation and training of staff needs to be looked at, because pharmaceuticals need to shift. Pharmaceutical professionals need to shift towards having biomedical engineering competencies or training. Again, also the vigilance that's required, post-market vigilance aspects can vary. So let's look also where this comes into is a whole ecosystem, of a shared responsibility. We have co-responsibilities. So governments is doing their work to establish policies, regulations to ensure timely access to medical devices, both safe and effective. Again, they're there to drive healthy cooperation. They facilitate transparency with stakeholders and enabling us to see the guidelines that are being developed, the draft of bills or acts, the bills that are being drafted before they become acts in Parliament. So public participation can be had, and also the best ideas can be contributed. Again, and manufacturers come to ensure products are being manufactured to meet standards and or exceed the required standards. So this whole ecosystem you can almost look at it like a hub and spoke, because for safe medical devices at the center, there's the patient and the HCP, who are both at that center. We are all there in that ecosystem in some capacity. Either you're in the R&D, either you're in the packaging and labeling, either you're in the quality aspects, you're in the conceptualization think tank area, you're actually in the deployment or in the marketing of such. So we all have our responsibility. Yeah. Again, I also just wanted to mention, because governments also have limited resources and so many competing priorities, there's a very much need for reliance or international cooperation. So overcoming these challenges to make sure this system is working effectively, there needs to be best use of resources available and expertise. Use the best that you have with do the best with what you have. Avoiding duplication again of work where it's avoidable. and focusing on regulatory efforts, or rather those efforts and resources where they're needed most. And there's a concept called regulatory reliance, and reliance is not a loss of sovereignty. It's actually just there to enhance regulatory outcomes and bring efficiency. So reliance as a concept is an act where one regulatory authority takes into account and gives significant weight assessments that have been performed by another regulatory authority or a trusted institution or other authoritative information and reaches its own decision with that information. Yeah. So again, there's a WHO technical reference document that gives best practices or principles around what is reliance and how does it go into the development of regulations for medical devices. So again, because we're not just in Africa, we're in a global landscape, and there are driving forces in so many different directions. The drivers for regulating medtech are not unique to Africa. There's accelerated aging populations all over the world because of better advances or deployments of technologies and healthcare is allowing us to prevent or manage chronic diseases longer. Rapid innovation in medtech, again, is addressing needs in healthcare. Governments, again, have interest in promoting well-being of its people and mitigating healthcare cost pressure. So governments are taking on a big responsibility to facilitate this access. And you can imagine in a world where we have 84 medical device national regulatory authorities, there's a lot of, when each agency is issuing a guideline, imagine the notification that each company or each stakeholder has to pick up and deal with. So them medical devices being so essential to the diagnosis and treatment of therapies, we cannot understate the importance for collaborating in a globalized world, but at the same time pushing for harmonization. Yeah. There's an urgent need to develop devices which also do meeting or addressing the needs which are unmet. In Africa, again, improving the lives of African patients and giving them access to medical care. We need to have regulations that are allowing us to build capacity. So again, if we have regulatory processes in Africa which are not well defined, countries may rely, they should rather rely on clearance from other medical device agencies or other medical device authorities, similarly like the European Medicines Agency or the US Food and Drug Authority, FDA. Some of these stringent regulatory authorities could give their evidences of pre-market approval, which then now can enhance countries which have NRAs still developing in capacity or other areas to then speed up their regulatory processes, yeah? Knowing that a stringent regulatory authority with excellent safety standards, those processes that they have could be relied on, and also mitigating expenses they incur in doing a similar assessment. Sometimes I say, or rather we can say originality can be overrated in some areas. So we just need to ensure that the considerations that are being developed are meeting the safety needs of our people. So AMDF, in Africa, we need to understand that there's been developments, or rather appreciate that there's been developments towards harmonizing. And the AMDF is one such initiative. It's a WHO regulatory framework that is there to give recommendations for medical devices and IVDs. So the way we have IMDRF, the group of 7 or so regulators who came together, the AMDRF is one for Africa. It's a forum that brings together regulators, the national regulatory authorities in Africa, and helps them develop best practices, or technical documents, building capacity to ensure that alignment is being developed in line with WHO and IMDRF. So their vision again is to enable access to medical devices for Africa and diagnostics of assured quality, safety, and performance. Their scope of work is various. They touch on common dossier submissions, quality and audit inspections, clinical performance studies, and post-market surveillance as well. So the AMDRF exists to build capacity. It conducts training programs for national regulatory authorities in Africa, and also is there to build capacity. So we have regulators like the one based in Kenya, the Pharmacy Poisons Board. You have the one based in South Africa, SAFRA. You have the Nigerian regulator, NAFDAC. Each regulatory, each body, either if it's the regional bloc, ECOWAS, IGAD, we have SADC, we have also EAC or COMESA. We have representation from each bloc that's being able to give their best practices into pre-market, placement on the market, and post-market activities. So this is a good positive step that we can also just look forward to the AMDF for establishing or bringing harmonization towards the space in Africa. We also have what they call the GMTA, Global Medical Technology Alliance. So this is a member association group. It represents companies that produce medical devices, diagnostics, and products in the health information systems space. These are transforming healthcare through earlier disease detections and various less invasive procedures. So the GMTA, being this association, also came out with core tenets for medical device regulation. It's a prestigious group, but at the same time, they're really a good network that bring together various group of stakeholders, both in private and public industry. So some of these principles, again, I'll just mention some of these ones which are abbreviated. So when we talk of adopt GRP, GRP is good regulatory practices. So good regulatory practices. Again, no one has a monopoly on this space. And again, at the same time, we want to just be able to ensure that things are being harmonized. And because it's a practice, it keeps evolving, it keeps getting better. So at the same time, there needs to be an attitude of continuous learning, that no one may have it cracked out the way they might think it to be. There could be a better way of doing something. Again, adopting or accepting global clinical data and use of real-world evidence, RWE. It's very important, again, that, like you're saying, our regulations are considering real-world evidence to see what is needed in our context here. Adopting EIFUs. EIFUs is instructions for use. So instructions for use is like the manual that comes with the device. So EIFU is electronic IFU. Again, in a technological world or digital world, a lot of people have access to digital spaces. So some of these equipment or instruments should have the adoption for access to some of their manuals electronically again. It's also a ESG initiative, and they're talking of saving, rather managing the impact on the environment and sustainability in manufacturing, moving away from printing paper and actually deploying different ways for access is a good initiative. The only challenge is to have the considerations, again, like we said, of infrastructure. You need to ensure that there's power capacity and stability. You need to consider that there's network and infrastructure to support remote access. So some of these things are all principles that the private industry is driving together with stakeholders within the governmental space. So AMDF, again, just wanted to mention AMDF has a governance framework. This is what is showing on the image right now. There's a steering committee. Again, AMDF falls under the AMRC. There's a regulators conference. There's an assembly that meets, I think, annually. And then they have their technical working groups, which are falling under the steering committee. The AMDF is an initiative under NEPAD, AUC, the African Union Initiative. They have, again, a secretariat who's connected to the committee. These technical working groups also focus on certain areas. There's regulatory capacity, pharmacovigilance, blood and blood products, again, medical devices. There's a secretariat for the regional harmonization, again, and the AMDF then now is focused on areas, giving guidelines, building capacity, and building technical expertise around these three areas. And then there's technical working groups who have experts. So this is a good initiative that we can appreciate from. If you're interested, you can go look at the website, the AMDF. Just search them up. You can also check out, they have issued guidelines for various practices for medical devices. They have 4 guidelines in English and French. And it's a dynamic space. I believe that they have a tenure of, I think, 3 years as a steering committee. So we have a rotating, again, secretariat. We have with representation across the continent. Yeah, I think also just to mention some benefits the AMDF has delivered. They've been able to develop technical guidance during the COVID pandemic, and also to enable listing of COVID-19 diagnostics, the IVDs, which need to be updated from time to time. They've given list of medical devices, products which are needed for surveillance, prevention, and control of certain public health issues or case management. Again, they're also giving guidance on management of IVDs and medical device donations. And then just to contextualize the AMDF, what you can see now on your screen again is maybe just an overview of the African regulatory space. So this excluding Southern Africa, but just to give you a gist, the countries that you see here is just to show an overview of where there's full regulation, maturity, or establishment. Some countries have partial regulation. Some countries have no regulation. So again, you'll find that looking at the map, majority of the countries, or there's a good number that's red, there's a lot of opportunity and work cut out for the regulatory space in terms of harmonization, in terms of creating access and reliance pathways. But also there's opportunities for learning, there's centers of excellence in some areas. So again, it just needs to be appreciated that there's a lot of work cut out, and it's not anyone's problem that's one to own, but it's everyone's responsibility. Yeah, so again, this slide is just to enhance or emphasize the importance. Again, most medical devices may not be built for challenges that are faced in African countries. So again, regulatory systems need to be designed to ensure they're essentially delivering safety and efficacy for their people. If we don't have countries with a well regulatory defined process like the other slide reflected, it can discourage innovators, both within Africa and outside, from developing quality medical devices suitable for challenges. There is an opportunity. I think there's just, the landscape is quite massive. So most countries, although have mandate for medical device regulation in their national legislation, there is a mandate. Few of them employ all the guidelines set forth by the WHO. So there's also a challenge of, if you have a national legislation, are you aligning to the WHO or are you aligning to best practice? Again, we need to consider, in a globalized world, we've signed treaties or we're signatories to some agreements. So when we signed on, to example, the WTO, World Trade Organization agreement, there's certain obligations we have for enhancing or enabling trade, that we shouldn't be issuing guidelines as a country that are bringing hindrances to technical trade, or rather technical barriers to trade. So if a policy is brought in that is going to then impact on the tariff or customs market, then that's a technical barrier to trade. If you're going to issue a guideline that doesn't align with international best practice or standards, that's a technical barrier to trade. There's an obligation for the governments who have signed on to these to follow. There's the ministries of trade or industry that are meant to collaborate and ensure that they're aligning with best practice. And where there's deviations, there's room for correction. But I think it's also just all about what's the posture or the attitude on implementing or developing a regulation. A regulation should be there to help, not to harm. So that's what we are calling for. Again, if there's any need or rather call for action, it's for an convergence and bringing together common regulatory frameworks. Where there's a challenge, you can also see the picture on the screen. A lot of us will never know. We could be one ailment away from being one of the people on either on the walker or with a bandage. So you'd really hope and want to be sure that the regulatory frameworks are there to work for you, not to harm you as such. So for national regulatory authorities, there's also challenges because they are extensions of a government. They don't operate in isolation. There's a necessary or really strong emphasis on importance for availability of a legal framework. And this they've all cited as important because without a legal framework, these national regulatory authorities cannot enforce or empower any regulation they set forth, right? Without a legal backing or basis, it could be a fool's errand. So again, the legal framework gives scope and it provides legal clarity with backing. So it gives definitions and allows them to then now develop, to rather put teeth to their jaws. I wanted to just show this in preparation for this this talk. Actually, I came across this research that was done. I found quite interesting. So this is just showing an overview of some select countries that there was a research done on the levels of medical device regulation across certain countries, and there was a correlation they were trying to look at between the year that a country gained its independence and how it correlates to its maturity of regulations for medical devices. So you can have varied maturity. Light green is established, quite mature. The dark green is no formal regulatory process. So again, when you look at, that's what picture A is representing, the maturity of regulations. And picture B is representing the years of independence. So the darker, the older, rather the darker, the younger the country is. The lighter the color, the more younger, the older it is rather. Sorry, I'm getting mixed up there. But I think you get the gist. But what you'll find is there's a very interesting correlation. South Africa, which relatively did not get its independence, got it fairly, actually, let's look at this color. This is actually close to there. But South Africa got it quite relatively late or long ago, but has an established process. But when you look at, for example, actually, yes, the years of independence. So 10, thereabouts, and has quite a mature established process again. But South Sudan got its independence just thereabouts, I think in 2011 or 2014. And thereabouts, no formal regulatory process. So this was quite some interesting study I found. Just for interest to this audience, I thought it would be quite interesting for everyone to understand. Could be some more, I think, an interesting discussion as they continue to study how these regulations develop and how they're established again, and where there's convergence or confluence. So just to bring a last call to action, again, regulatory convergence and reliance is for all regulators. And we are calling for a regulatory framework in Africa that enhances or speaks to their spirit. Again, for any law that's being developed, you need to have a spirit behind it that can be able to carry the day and that can be able to move throughout the nations again and throughout the thoughts, because we are in a dynamic region. We have 55 member states in Africa. We have diverse cultures, so many tribes, clans. At the same time, we have language barriers. But when we trade, we all trade for the same commodities. We all trade in similar blocks. Some of the challenges we have could be innate from our own folly in implementing the wrong regulations, rather. So I think understanding the spirit in which we operate in and the contexts as which rather medical devices also need to be supported by, I think we really need to then call for, or rather we want to see an expanded regulatory capacity. And through reliance, we're able to enhance that or see that. NRAs can be able to minimize resource expenditure and really be efficient in developing or creating new medical device regulations. Policymakers, again, should facilitate or adopting or amending existing harmonized regulations. There's no need to be making retreats to then now expend resources to reinvent something that has already been established and works. Again, ministries of health, we want to see a prioritization of local capacity building. This is an initiative that they have to drive. I think through the AU NEPAD, the initiative to have manufacturing of certain commodities from pharmaceuticals to medical devices in Africa is there. That initiative then now behooves governments to ensure there's regulatory frameworks, and to ensure there's a regulatory framework, they need to build capacity, they need to employ resources, they need to ensure that they get finances from the government budgets. They need to ensure that, rather, governments also need to ensure there's autonomy in terms of how they can use that money, because a lot of the time the patients need products, but we as suppliers or people in the industry who are manufacturers, we are needing to get the service from government. So when we pay for the services, we expect the service. So that's where government needs to also have operational efficiency and autonomy to deliver the services that is required for the healthcare systems. Again, making sure there's well-trained personnel, there's the proper systems from an IT perspective. Most of the the national regulatory authorities can go online. COVID may have actually accelerated some of the digital transformation there. So again, also improving regulatory standards. And medical technology companies, again, have obligations. We could collaborate with governments for charitable divisions, or again, in our companies where we can consider investments in building capacity, having a training pathway for certain, if not our industry stakeholders, our HCPs. We know we do have availability for capacity building with HCPs. We could now look at, even as an industry association, collaboration with building capacity and technical expertise, knowledge sharing with our regulators. When we open up and be transparent, you'll find that we're able to build trust. And I think that's the big important takeaway for such a forum, or such a professionals as yourselves also, as you go into industry, as you go into practice. The most important thing is the perception also. You can drive or shape the perception, and it's how we communicate and how we engage meaningfully and intentionally. I think all these efforts can be able to then drive better access in Africa for regulations or through regulatory frameworks, and also capacity building and innovation can help harmonize regulatory standards across Africa. So I think I'll leave it there for now.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve, for a wonderful presentation. That has been very enlightening and very insightful. And it gets us to the next bit, where we are now taking up the questions from our audience, for the people who are listening in, taking up questions that they might have. So anybody with a question, feel free to raise your hand, or even just type it on the chat or the question and answer section. But then as we look at that as well, I think maybe the question that I would be keen to understand from you, Steve, in terms of the development within the African landscape in medical device regulation, what opportunities are coming up, especially around, we know African Medical Agency, AMA, is coming in. But then the conversation has been around health product security. Is medical devices in scope of that? And if that's going to happen, then what are the key aspirations that we as stakeholders within the ecosystem should be working towards?
Perfect. Thanks, David. I think for health product security, it's definitely there. The opportunities are vast, or rather, I think ever increasing daily, or at least monthly. AMA is there. And I think we can also see AMA is there for medicines, the African Medicines Agency, and they were established in 2009, and they've been doing the collaboration, mutual recognition registration under EAC for pharmaceuticals. There's proof of concept, but I think also the spirit needs to really be driven as much as the law is there. There's also challenges there we can learn from, because AMA, since it was established, I think we've had challenges when we talk to industry players, where they've gone for that mutual recognition registration pathway, but the outcomes have not been as promising as intimated. So in that essence, we're also seeing that there's need for re-engagement, and a strong re-engagement. Why again do we not have this pathway working for us? Maybe we need to also go back and have honest discussions or reflections first. I think we also need to be honest in our reflections. Do we not trust this procedure? Or do we not want it to work? What is the political goodwill also we need? I think those are also the difficult questions we need to ask ourselves, both emotionally and intellectually. I mean, health security or health product security cannot be understated. I think also for pharmaceuticals, the risks, like I said, are magnitude in nature from within the patient, within their toxicity. But there's health product security in different aspects, apart from medical devices, where you also have the risks in terms of the operation of the therapy or execution of that therapy. You also have systems I talked of, like Internet of Things, for example, and you have a device which works in an ecosystem where healthcare has a Wi-Fi network, perhaps, and the MRIs. For example, even we see this in our homes, the new technology of washing machines, fridges. I'm sure even soon your ironing machine will have a Wi-Fi component where you can connect it, and then you can be able to preheat it. You see the Internet of Things where your device, as a phone, a smartphone, is now connecting even with 30 technologies, your fridge, your lights, your microwave, your washing machine. So that is also going to exist in healthcare. There's Bluetooth devices that can be activated or operated through such systems for medical devices. There's also some which use cloud technology. There's also some which use radio frequency. So when you look at some of those aspects, PPP may not be the only one who's involved. There's aspects of data privacy. There's aspects of data security, or rather ethical hacking. How do you mitigate security networks breaches? So that aspect, I think, of health product security is so paramount. Opportunities are there. If you love programming, if you love tech, and you have a healthcare background, I think medical devices space is interesting, because pharma, you guys all know pharmaceuticals, but medtech is quite interesting. Like I said, it's close to IT. So if you like to also dabble or go into another space, there's a latitude in terms of industry. You can move laterally into the industry. You can start working. Look at companies like Best Buy or Walmart, and these are companies in America. I mean, a massive market for the medtech industry, but these are pathways where they have opportunities for selling products, devices. So even like MyDawa or Good Life, establishments like that, God willing, who knows what they might be doing for the medtech space. When you walk into a system and they need a biomedical engineer, they need someone who understands AI and how it operates with a healthcare system. So people who are also in data and analytics and similar aspects like that, I think would find an interesting interesting avenues and also opportunities to fulfill their career or personal development.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. I think for those who are tech enthusiasts, this is an opportunity that we should look into, but also it's about looking at it in the sense that we focus on the regulation of medicines and medical products and all, but then how do we get to interface and ensure that the technologies are also as regulated? Because when you're talking about the Internet of Things, imagine somebody with a defibrillator, with a heart pacemaker or such, and somebody hacks it. That person can decide whether you live or you die the next minute. So how do we regulate such kind of provisions? I think that's a critical bit that we need to ensure is in place. And I saw a question from Denish.
Yes, thanks, David, and thank you, Steve, for the wonderful presentation, for the insights that you have provided. My question is with regard to MedSAP. I know you have not talked about it, which is a medical device single audit program that is the hot topic recently with regards to medical devices. So maybe you can talk about it, what it's it, and what advantage does it confer to stakeholders in the medical device space. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Danish. Thanks. I think you must have your pulse or ear to the ground because that's hot off the press news. I think you're a keen follower, I think, of recent events. So that's good to hear and know. So MDSAP is a recent, rather it's an initiative again that came out of IMDRF, the forum of those stringent regulatory bodies. So they found out that these seven authorities were all deciding to do an inspection for certain facilities, a company. So the US guys are going in this schedule. The guys from Japan are going in this schedule. So they all decided, look, we all want to do a similar audit and want to get the same outcome. So they came out with a program where they can all do a joint inspection of facilities. So a company or manufacturer applies to undergo a MDSAP, medical device single audit program. So that means they invite or make an application for the certain regulators to come. The regulators then now make that scheduled inspection. A group of probably 3 or 5 regulators, different regulators, will then undergo and perform that inspection. So this inspection, once it's conducted, there's a review that they do. Each country does their own review. They share it. And the MDSAP is a program where other national regulatory authorities can become affiliate members too. So what you're referring to is what it means for us. In Africa, we have precedent, recent one, where the MDSAP program, which is existing, Kenya recently became an affiliate member, the Kenya Pharmacy Poisons Board. So what this means now is Kenya is then able to get capacity building and training of expertise, resource development from regulators who are then now the originating or the operating members of the MDSAP. So the US FDA, the EU, Japan, all those stringent regulators are going to then now start training and building capacity for PPB. PPB at the same time, becoming an affiliate member, is then going to be able to have access to MDSAP reports that have already been issued. So an MDSAP report, once a report has been issued by the joint inspectors, it's independently reviewed, but jointly accepted. That's what I believe. No country can reject the report. That's what I'm told. So each country does their review, but once they adopt it, no country can reject it. Yeah. But now there's also aspects of where, for example, and what it means. Let me give you a context. So what it means for Kenya. So manufacturers who are here locally in Kenya will have an opportunity to be able to get certified to expand to stringent regulatory areas. What that means, for example, once Kenya PPP is able and has capacity to then do an MDSAP audit, Yeah, the MDSAP members are happy with PPB as an affiliate member to conduct an MDSAP audit. A local manufacturer here can apply to undergo MDSAP audit. That means that they have an opportunity to beef up or build up their capacity to raise their game. And if they can get certified as an MDSAP entity, meaning they underwent an audit by stringent regulatory authorities, Kenya present, in the presence of Japan or Australia, Canada, US, you get certified. That means you have an MDSAP certificate, ISO 13485, which can be recognized in the US, which can be recognized. So you can also then start to pre-qualify or push for WHO or other contracts or tenders. So there's a commercial or opportunity. There's a technical opportunity for capacity and exposure, capacity building and training, certification as well. So that's an opportunity from a trade perspective or commercial perspective. What it means, I think, for us then, opening up our market to then export, building capacity locally. And I think for us, it's just the beginning of reliance. One aspect where PPB is leveraging on expertise and the best use of resources so that it doesn't have to conduct inspections. It also will mean that we can mitigate costs for inspections. Yeah, so I know the current countries in Africa which want to do GMP inspections for medical devices is Ghana. And we also have Nigeria that wants to do inspections of GMP, and Tanzania. So if you're able to undergo an MDSAP audit, you can waive or get exemption for being inspected mandatorily by these regulators. So I think there's those sorts of opportunities. There will be challenges, or there are challenges, because I can imagine it's not a cheap affair. It will have its financial cost. But I think the benefits, then now we need to have that discussion or assessment of what are the cost benefits of such an initiative. But it's a good initiative for the regulatory space. Kenya PPB specifically, I think, is championing that space, trying to lead in the aspects of reliance. And I think we should look out or look keenly at such spaces for collaborative opportunities like that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Danish, I hope that is satisfactory.
Yes, thanks so much, Steve.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
And that's great. I can see that we have 7 minutes to the top of the hour. So probably I'd give you just a minute to take your water as I give the final announcements, then we can come to the end of the session.
Okay.
Let me know when you can see my screen for those who are checking it out for me. Fantastic. So as we are coming to the end of the session, it's a wrap for us in terms of the continuing engagement that we've been having for our courses and also the activities that we have. Next week, for the people who are part of the regulatory affairs class, we'll be having our final lecture. Then subsequently on Friday, we will be having the regulatory affairs networking cocktail. And this is an invite to all of us who are part of this call. Please RSVP with our colleague Juliet already mentioned, and actually her contacts are also here. Reach out to her from more the cocktail. So be sharing more details with you, what overview of what we have, and it will be great to have you with us, get connected. Community of practice of people you can reach out to when you need their guidance or need their insights, so that we shape an industry that works for all of us and an industry that thrives on the value, collaboration, and visionary outlook. So that would be good for us as we go along. Last announcement that I had for all of us. In the meantime, in case you have any concerns, feel free to reach out. Let us know how we can support you. And I see Juliet has already shared the registration link for the cocktail as well. We'll be able to engage and see how that works. For those of us who are part of this webinar, having their CPD points awarded by the Pharmacy and Poisons Board in Kenya, this webinar is CPD accredited. My call to you is please ensure that you do subscribe for the CPD program on the Pharmacy and Poisons Board portal. The points, we will not send you the tokens. We will be issuing the tokens on our end, on the back end, to ensure that your participation in this particular meeting is correlated to the CPD that you're getting to be awarded. So you don't have to wait for tokens. You don't need to send emails requesting. We will be coordinating that. And the only thing that you need to confirm is that you've subscribed Then subsequently in a week or two, you'll be able to have your points already awarded on your portal as you move along. With that, I'll give you the last opportunity to give us your final remarks, Steve, as we come to the end of the session. Thank you and have a good one, everyone. Over to you, Steve. Yes.
Thanks, David. I think it's been a great opportunity for me. I've been really pleased and I think humbled to be a part of this. And I hope it was really beneficial to the audience or insightful. I hope it's going to open up riveting conversations or enriching conversations, perhaps, that can then now start to shape the better landscape for Africa. I think probably raise the tide or change the tide from where it is right now. I think for everyone here who's going through this cohort, I wish to just congratulate you on where you've reached thus far on the milestone and wish you all the best. I think you guys are going into a world where you're professionals in your own right, but there's a continuing need for practice, or rather a practice that's continuously evolving. So keep evolving with the practice, I think, and learning, I think, should be your best friend. And keep collaborating, keep engaging. Opportunities, I think, like this that the APN is giving is very important. So don't take them lightly or for granted. I think they open up great doors and also give you a challenge or sharpen your edge in your career. So thank you. I wish you guys all the best and look forward to more spaces like this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's been a pleasure, and we look forward to continued engagements as we move forward. We wish you all a great evening and a great afternoon for those who are logging out of the country to whichever places that you're logging in from. Thank you and have a good one.
Thanks.